Same species, same basic needs, completely different worlds. In 1793, British diplomat George Staughton first set foot in China and wrote, "Chinese civilization may be humanity's most important case study." More than 2 centuries later, his question still stands. Why did one civilization build competitive pluralism while the other built unbreakable unity? Through the mirror of China, we find 6 foundations that made us different. "74,000 years ago, a supervolcano on the island of Sumatra erupted with a force that dwarfed anything in recorded human history. The Toba catastrophe plunged Earth into a volcanic winter lasting nearly 1,000 years. Our species was nearly erased, reduced, some geneticists believe, to perhaps a few thousand surviving individuals. Those survivors did something unprecedented. They left home. They cooperated across tribal boundaries. They reimagined from scratch how human beings could live together. If our shared DNA is humanity's universal hardware, and we are genetically 99.9% identical, then the wildly different social software that each civilization built in response to its environment is what made China and the West into such profoundly different worlds. 2 questions follow me everywhere I go. Western audiences ask, why has China, across thousands of years, never quite escaped the cycle of centralized imperial control? And overseas Chinese communities ask, why does modern, universal civilization always seem just one step out of reach? The answer is not in our genes. It is in a set of foundational operating systems built over millennia, running beneath the surface of every dynasty, every revolution, every reform that have shaped how Chinese civilization thinks, governs, and understands itself. These are the 6 foundations, and understanding them is not an act of hostility. It is the beginning of clarity. Before we examine those foundations, we need a precise instrument, something sharp enough to cut through one of the most common sources of confusion in any discussion of China. We need to separate civilization from culture. Culture is local, plural, and carries no moral rank. It is the food you eat, the festivals you celebrate, the gods you pray to, the stories you tell your children. Every culture deserves respect on its own terms. There is no hierarchy of cuisines or folk songs. Civilization is something entirely different. Civilization is the institutional design, the system that determines how power is distributed, how resources are extracted from the population, who makes the rules, and who must obey them. And on this measure, civilizations can absolutely be compared. Inclusive institutions, as the economists Acemoglu and Robinson demonstrated, produce sustained prosperity. Extractive institutions produce cycles of boom and collapse. Here is the sleight of hand that authoritarian systems have always relied upon. They disguise criticism of the institution as an attack on the culture. To question the system becomes conveniently a betrayal of the people. We will not make that mistake here. For Western audiences, Chinese history can appear bafflingly continuous, as though the first emperor's ghost has been running the show ever since. But Chinese history contains a violent rupture that changes everything. Before 221 BC, China operated under what historians call the Zhou system. The Zhou king was not an absolute ruler. He was more like a feudal overlord, bound by mutual obligations to his aristocratic vassals. Rights and duties ran in both directions. Local autonomy was real. This political culture, in many ways, resembles the early contractual traditions of Western feudalism more than it resembles imperial China. Then came 221 BC. The Qin unification was not simply a political achievement. It was a total overhaul of the social operating system. The first emperor dismantled every aristocratic check on power, abolished the feudal contract, and built a system that reached directly from the imperial throne to every household in China. The historian Qianmu described it this way: the Roman Empire was like a single great lamp hanging in the center of a room. Shatter it, and the whole room goes dark. But China after the Qin was like lamps placed in every corner, each one casting its light across the others. It sounds like resilience, but those lamps came at a price. Ordinary people now stood alone, directly beneath the imperial gaze, with nothing between them and the full weight of state power. The first and deepest foundation is how each civilization understood space itself, its relationship to the world beyond its borders. China built what scholars call Tianxia, all under heaven. Picture a set of concentric circles radiating outward from the imperial capital. The innermost ring is the civilized center. The outer rings are progressively more barbaric, more distant from the source of order and virtue. In this framework, there are no equal partners. There are only the center and those who submit to it. The West evolved something structurally different: the idea that multiple sovereign powers can coexist, each recognizing the other's right to exist. This logic crystallized in 1648 in the Treaty of Westphalia, the foundation of the modern international order, built on the principle of equal sovereignty. These are not just philosophical differences, they are products of geography. East Asia is, in geological terms, a funnel. Surrounded by ocean to the east, the Tibetan Plateau to the west, the Gobi Desert to the north, once a power controlled the central plain, there was nowhere else for competitors to go. Monopoly was the natural endpoint. The Mediterranean was the opposite, a shattered mosaic of coastlines, peninsulas, and islands. No single power could dominate it for long. Competition was structurally unavoidable, and from sustained competition came law, because rivals need rules to manage their disputes. And from law came rights, and from rights came everything that followed. Every civilization must answer one fundamental question: what sits above the ruler? In the Western tradition, the answer evolved over centuries, from God to natural law to the inalienable rights of the individual. Each of these was an authority independent of the state, a court of appeal that even emperors and kings had to acknowledge. The historian Yu Yingxi identified this as the key difference in what he called the Axial Age, that remarkable period around 500 BC, when civilizations across Eurasia simultaneously developed new frameworks for understanding the world. China chose what Yu called immanent transcendence. The highest values, benevolence, righteousness, ritual propriety, were to be realized within this world through human relationships and personal cultivation. The divine, in the Confucian tradition, is not a judge sitting above history. It is an aspiration to be embodied in human conduct. The West chose transcendent transcendence. God, or natural law, exists outside and above the human world, capable of rendering judgment on the powerful as well as the powerless. The institutional consequence of this difference is enormous. In China, the emperor was the son of heaven, simultaneously the supreme political authority and the supreme spiritual authority. There was no independent court above him, no institution capable of saying thus far and no further. Without that external check, political power had no ceiling, and power without a ceiling, given enough time, becomes total. The sociologist Fei Xiaotong described Chinese social structure with an image that has never been bettered: the differential mode of association. Imagine dropping a stone into still water. The ripples spread outward from the point of impact, close, then diminishing, then fading. In Chinese social ethics, every person is the stone, and every relationship is defined by its distance from that center. Family first, then extended kin, then neighbors, then community, then strangers. Your obligations and your rights depend entirely on where you stand in relation to the center of power. The logic of Western modernity runs in the opposite direction. Every individual possesses certain rights simply by virtue of being human, regardless of their proximity to the powerful. The historian Qin Hui developed an analysis he called large community paternalism. He argued that the Qin system did something uniquely destructive. It systematically dismantled every intermediate community, every clan network, every village compact, every guild, every local institution that might mediate between the individual and the state. What remained was the atomized individual standing alone before the full power of imperial authority. Qin Hui called this universal serfdom, not slavery in the legal sense, but something more insidious: a social ecosystem in which the conditions for independent selfhood never existed. The self that never had room to grow cannot be blamed for failing to become autonomous. The system was designed from the beginning to prevent exactly that. How does a civilization think? Not what does it think about, but what are the structural habits of mind that it reaches for when it tries to understand the world? China's classical framework was the system of yin and yang, and the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, cycling through patterns of mutual generation and mutual destruction. I see it as associative thinking at its most elegant. Everything is connected to everything else. Everything flows into everything else. The cosmos is a vast web of resonances and correspondences. This framework produced genuine insights in medicine, in agriculture, in statecraft. But it has a structural limitation. It is not falsifiable. A system of thought that can explain everything, that can always find a correspondence, always identify a resonance, effectively explains nothing. It cannot be proved wrong, which means it cannot be refined. It generates wisdom, but not science. The ancient Greeks built something architecturally different: a tradition of axiomatic reasoning in which claims had to follow logically from stated premises, and those premises had to survive public challenge. This is not just a different style of thinking. It is a different relationship to the possibility of being wrong. Modern science inherits this tradition. It runs on the assumption that any hypothesis, however elegant, must be tested against reality and abandoned if reality disagrees. This capacity for structured self-correction is what produces exponential growth in knowledge. A civilization that cannot be wrong cannot learn. It can only repeat itself, with greater and greater refinement in an ever tighter circle. Language is not merely a tool for expressing thought. It is the medium in which thought occurs, and different writing systems shape cognition in different ways. Chinese characters are uniquely among living writing systems logographic. Each character carries meaning in its visual form, not in its sound. This gave the Chinese writing system an extraordinary administrative property. It could be read by speakers of mutually unintelligible dialects. A Cantonese speaker and a Mandarin speaker, unable to understand a word the other says, can read the same text and extract the same meaning. For an empire spanning thousands of miles and hundreds of dialect groups, this was a bureaucratic miracle. The first emperor's policy of unified writing, standardizing the script across all conquered territories, was one of the most effective acts of state building in human history. But logographic writing also has costs. Because characters carry meaning holistically rather than analytically, they tend to reward intuitive, associative reading over precise definitional analysis. You can grasp the meaning of a Chinese text without being able to fully unpack the logical structure of its argument. Alphabetic writing, by contrast, forces a kind of analytical discipline. You must build meaning from components, which trains a habit of decomposition. And the Chinese script, precisely because of its complexity and its cultural prestige, became a weapon of control. The literary inquisitions of the Qing dynasty prosecuted individuals and their entire families for the ideological implications of a single poem, a single phrase, a single character. And so we arrive at the most haunting pattern in all of Chinese history, the cycle that never ends. The Qin system contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The logic of administrative security first, prioritize stability above all, produces a bureaucracy that grows without limit, an apparatus of control that consumes ever more of the resources it was built to protect. Tax burdens rise. Land concentrates in fewer hands. The peasant majority is squeezed past the point of survival, and then the collapse. Not a gradual decline, a catastrophic implosion. The numbers are staggering. At the fall of the Qin, China's population dropped from roughly 20 million to 13 million. At the end of the Han Dynasty, from 55 million to 23 million. The Mongol conquest of Song China reduced the population from perhaps 120 million to 60 million. There was one moment when China nearly escaped this trap. In the 11th century, the Song dynasty and the Liao Empire, a non-Chinese power controlling northern China, concluded the Shanyuan Treaty. Two sovereign states acknowledging each other's right to exist, managing their disputes through negotiation rather than conquest. It was, arguably, the closest China ever came to a Westphalian moment before the modern era. Song China in that period was the most economically and technologically sophisticated civilization on earth. But the Mongols came, then the Ming, then the Qing. Each dynasty reached back into the Qin playbook. The cycle restarted. And with each restart, the possibility of escape grew a little more distant. Lord Acton wrote, "The facts are sacred, not the stories we build around them, not the golden ages we construct to justify the present, not the narrative of unbroken civilizational glory that makes inconvenient questions feel like betrayals. The facts. China's history is not primarily a story of imperial achievement and occasional chaos. It is the story of ordinary people, farmers and merchants, mothers and scholars, living and dying within a system that was never designed for their benefit. A system that survived not because it was good, but because it was stable. And stability in a system with no external checks is just another word for the successful suppression of alternatives. To move beyond the 2,000-year trap of the Qin system requires three upgrades to the operating system. The first is historical honesty, the courage to see the system clearly, to name what it cost, and to refuse the comfort of mythologized pasts, because the facts are sacred. The second is the rule of law, a genuine independent check on power, not a performance of legality, but an institution with real teeth, capable of holding the powerful accountable, whatever you call it, constitution, natural law, divine judgment. It must exist outside the reach of the state. The third is rational humility, the willingness to test ideas against evidence, to be wrong, to change. A civilization that can correct its own errors is a civilization with a future. Understanding the six foundations is not an act of hostility toward Chinese civilization. It is an act of respect for the hundreds of millions of people inside it and for what it might yet become. This is Kong Su's history. And in every episode, we are looking for the same thing: the path toward freedom, hidden in the facts of the past.